Alright guys, I'm just gonna say it. You suck at fishing a Whopper Plopper. Alright, that may be a little extreme, but I think there are a few things you can do to make yourself better at fishing a Whopper Plopper. Generally speaking, I think a lot of people think this bait is just a throw and wind kind of bait, takes no skill, but I beg to differ. I throw a Whopper Plopper very specifically. I throw it in certain situations, I throw it on certain gear, and I think that I do things that get me more bites on a Whopper Plopper than you, or maybe somebody else, or maybe not you. Maybe you're great at it. In any case, I'm gonna tell you guys what I think the biggest mistakes are when it comes to fishing a Whopper Plopper, especially in river situations. So the first mistake that I want to focus on when it comes to fishing a Whopper Plopper, one of the world's most famous topwater baits, is using too slow of a gear ratio on your reel. What I suggest you guys throw this on is at least a 7.3 to 1 gear ratio. I throw it on an 8.5 to 1 gear ratio as often as I can. The absolute slowest I will go would be that 7.3. If you're throwing this on a 6 something, you're just not going to be able to catch up to the fish. So specifically when it comes to river smallmouth, they have a tendency to come up, grab the bait, and then dart for it. And a lot of times when they're darting and they're swimming super fast, where are they going? They're coming right at you. So if you're not burning that reel and you're not picking up all that slack, you're not providing the tension that you need in order to keep those treble hooks buried. Now the Whopper Plopper hooks are great. I love the hooks, but if you're not supplying the tension that you need with your rod and reel, you're gonna lose more fish. Now, in the same vein, if you're throwing a Whopper Plopper on a reel that is spooled up with mono or fluoro, I think you're doing it wrong. I don't see any reason why mono or fluoro is better than braid in this scenario. And there are a couple of reasons I say this. And the first one is that when you're throwing a plopper, you should be tucking it close to cover. And if you're anything like me, you're not gonna make a perfect cast every single time. And that means you're going over wood, or whatever it may be, and you're fraying up your line. I know that we all probably retie here and there, but I think we all could probably get better at that. But why not sidestep the entire issue and throw braid, something that's not gonna fray out in the exact same way. Now it'll wear itself down, sure, but it's not gonna fray at the time that you need it when there's a huge smallmouth on the end of the line, it's pulling really hard, it's diving, and then that line just pops off because you were throwing it up into the trees every now and then and you got some nicks in your line. Another reason braid is just going to outperform mono or fluoro when it comes to fishing a plopper is that you just have more power. I don't know if you guys have caught a 5-pound river smallie that instantly dives down to a big brush pile or tree as soon as it's hooked on a plopper, but if you have, you know that the power that they have is quite substantial. And if you're using braid, you're able to hoist that fish out and really pull them out as fast as you possibly can to eliminate the possibility of them getting wrapped up in all the junk that's beneath the surface. And lastly, throwing braid, and this might be a smaller consideration, but for me as a northern river smallmouth angler, I'm gonna run into a lot of pike, and those pike have a tendency to come up and completely engulf the bait, and when they do that, their teeth have access to the line. That's gonna slice a lot of things right in half. Now if you're using heavy enough fluoro or something, sure, that's maybe not an issue, and even sometimes with braid, if it's lighter braid, they can cut through that. Braid is just gonna keep that plopper on your line for a lot longer, especially if you're fishing around toothy fish. So before we get too deep into this video, what I want you guys to do is comment down below, how do you fish a Whopper Plopper? What's your gear? What's your setup? What's your favorite retrieve? Is there something you're doing that's different than the rest of the guys out there that's getting you more bites? If so, if you want to share, go ahead and drop a comment down below. Now, let's get into how you're fishing the plopper. If you're one of those guys who chucks and winds and chucks and winds, you're missing bites. You're doing it wrong. Sorry, but that's something you need to accept. In my experience, the best thing you can do with the plopper, like a lot of other baits, is vary your retrieve. But I subscribe to like the pop, pop, pause retrieve, and then I'll wind a little bit, pop, pop, pause retrieve, and then I'll wind a little bit. That variation in the retrieve is gonna draw a lot more strikes than a straight retrieve. And so let's think about it. We throw the plopper out, it crashes down into the water, there's a big smallmouth not far away, it sees the initial crash, it grabs its attention, and all of a sudden you got 2 pops and then another pause. What does that bait look like? It's looking like something that's hurt, and that's easy pickings for a big fish that's willing to eat. Now if you keep doing that, you're gonna draw more and more attention, and maybe they're not in the mood to bite. This is where a little bit of winding actually works in your favor, because that again is another change. So when you pop, pop, pause, pop, pop, pause, and then you wind a little bit, again that looks like something that's darting or fleeing away, something that maybe realizes that the predator is nearby and is trying to get away, and that's going to trigger strikes as well. So why not vary your retrieve a little bit and catch a lot more fish? Get out of the mentality that a plopper is just a chuck and wind. I think you're missing a lot of fish that way. Now, since I've already mentioned making casts that are tight to cover, I really think we have to focus on doing that with this bait. And this goes back to the chuck and wind mentality. If we think that a fish is gonna come out and chase that bait as we wind it, and we're getting lazy with our casts, we think, oh, it'll draw fish in wherever they are. They only have to be in this kind of area for me to get a bite. I think that's not true. I have so much more success when I can tuck that plopper as close as possible to that log and give it a couple pops and let it sit there. So with this topwater bait, I really think we need to be as accurate with our casting and be able to repeat it over and over and over. Get out of the mindset that if there's a fish in the area, it's definitely gonna come chase it. It's gonna be, you know, swimming out in the main channel, we bring a plopper over the top of it and it's gonna come up and want to eat all the time. That's just not the case. I think we're much better off focusing our casts and being laser focused, being as tight as we can to whatever our target is, so that we're presenting that bait for a longer period of time right in the strike zone. Now, if you've ever fished a topwater bait like a plopper, you already know that it is very exciting, and sometimes that excitement causes us to make mistakes. So when we see that big smallmouth blowing up on the bait, our first instinct is to do what? To set the hook super hard and super quick, and that's costing us fish. What we really need to do is think about it from like a frog perspective, right? When that fish blows up on it, we want to give it a 1 or a 1-2 and then lean into them. We want them to come up, grab the bait and go back down, and then we're ripping them, and then we're setting those hooks really deep. If we are just firing right off the bat, we're gonna miss some fish, and I'm guilty like everybody else of doing this. It's not always gonna happen just because of the scenario when it comes to topwater fishing. But if we can keep that in the back of our mind and get used to that pause before we set the hook, that cadence is really going to bring a lot more fish into the boat. Another mistake I think a lot of people make is not committing to that top water bite, especially in the case of a plopper. They throw it a few times, they're not getting the numbers that they want, and so they put it away and do something else. Now, sometimes that's the right move, sometimes it's not. Personally, I am guilty of locking that plopper in my hand and force feeding them. And I do this for one main reason. No matter what size of the plopper you're using, I think it is a big fish bait. So even though I know I'm missing some bites, I'm willing to miss those bites so I can get just those few quality bites. And another thing as a topwater angler that we can't be afraid of is locking that bait in at times of the year where maybe you shouldn't be throwing it, right? I've had some really great days in April throwing topwater when other people are afraid to because the water's too cold. Now, to the fish, there is not a number that magically triggers them feeding on top. This has to do with the kind of river you're on and the aggressiveness of the fish on that day. But if you do lock in a topwater bait like a plopper on those days when you are getting bites, maybe not 25 bites, but maybe you're gonna get 5 quality bites, I guarantee they're gonna be better fish. So we have to commit to the plopper, and sometimes that means committing at times of the year where it may not be the bait that's gonna get us the most bites, but I guarantee, like I said, we're gonna get more quality bites that way. The last mistake that I think people make, and this mistake spans all sorts of different baits, not just topwater baits like a plopper, is our obsession with color. To me, color doesn't matter much when it comes to fishing a plopper. I typically have 2 colors and they're not super specific. I typically have a bright color on the white side and I have a dark color on the dark side. And I don't have anything in between. I literally have those 2 colors. If one doesn't work, I go to the others. I think if we're spending too much time thinking about, oh, this one has a little bit of green, I think they're keying in on that, I really don't think that's worth the thought. And I think we're wasting time if we're cycling through a couple different baits to find the right one when we could be at one extreme or the other. Now, certain factors such as water clarity and the weather should be the things that dictate, in addition to, of course, what the fish want, the color that you're throwing, all right? So don't be afraid to switch, but I think if we're switching too much and we're worrying too much about color, we're really not doing the kind of fishing that we should be doing, which is committing to the bait, making the right cast, having the right retrieve. If we're doing all those things in conjunction with more or less the right color, then I think we're gonna get a lot more fish and a lot more quality bites that way too.